My parents mistreated me, so I ran away from them. When they arrived, they sued me to take away my chain of restaurants. I never expected life to be kind to me. From as far back as I can remember, I was always the outsider, the one who never quite fit in. I wasn't born into a happy family. My parents, if they could even be called that, were more like wardens in a prison than loving guardians. My father was a hard, cold man who believed that discipline was the only way to shape a child. He was a man of few words, but when he did speak, it was always in anger or frustration. My mother, on the other hand, was a ghost in the house, a presence that was felt but never seen. She was distant, detached, as if she had resigned herself to the misery of her life and had no intention of lifting a finger to change it. My childhood was a series of never-ending punishments and emotional neglect. I wasn't a bad kid, at least I don't think I was, but that didn't matter. My father believed in harsh discipline. If I did anything he considered wrong, no matter how small, he would unleash his fury. I was beaten for the smallest infractions, like not finishing my homework fast enough or accidentally spilling a glass of water. Each beating was followed by a lecture on how worthless I was, how I would never amount to anything, how I was just a burden on his already difficult life. I began to believe him. How could I not? He was the only voice of authority in my life, and my mother never defended me. She would just watch with those empty eyes, as if I wasn't even there. School was no refuge from the hell that was my home. If anything, it was worse. I was a quiet kid, which made me an easy target for bullies. The other kids seemed to sense that there was something different about me, something weak. They picked on me relentlessly. I was the butt of every joke, the target of every cruel prank. My days at school were filled with anxiety, knowing that at any moment, someone could decide to make my life miserable just because they could. Teachers weren't any better. They saw me as a problem student, someone who was always daydreaming, never paying attention. They never bothered to ask why I was like that, why I was so withdrawn. Instead, they just assumed I was lazy or stupid, and they treated me accordingly. There was one teacher in particular, Mr. Hendricks, who seemed to take a perverse pleasure in singling me out. He was a tall, imposing man with a permanent scowl on his face. He would call on me in class, knowing full well that I didn't know the answer, and then berate me in front of everyone when I stammered and stumbled over my words. He once grabbed me by the arm so hard that it left a bruise, just because I hadn't completed an assignment. When I told my parents about it, my father just shrugged and said, "You probably deserved it." That was the end of that. I spent most of my childhood alone, hiding in my room, trying to stay out of sight. Books became my only friends. They were my escape, my way of pretending that I was somewhere else, someone else. I read anything I could get my hands on: adventure stories, science fiction, mysteries. In those pages, I found worlds where the heroes were strong, brave, and kind. They were everything I was not, and everything I wished I could be. High school was more of the same. The bullying didn't stop, it just got more sophisticated. Instead of just pushing me around, the other kids would spread rumors about me, call me names behind my back, and make fun of me for every little thing. They knew how to hit where it hurt the most. They would mock me for my clothes, for my quietness, for the fact that I didn't have any friends. It was like being pecked to death by 1,000 tiny birds, each peck small on its own. But together they tore me apart. I tried to disappear, to make myself as small and unnoticeable as possible. I would sit at the back of the class, keep my head down, and avoid eye contact with anyone. But it didn't matter. They always found me. It was as if I had a target painted on my back that no one else could see but them. Things reached a breaking point in my junior year. There was a boy named Travis who had it out for me more than anyone else. He was the star of the football team, tall, muscular, and popular. Everyone liked him, or at least they pretended to. He had everything I didn't: looks, charisma, confidence, and for some reason he decided that I was going to be his personal punching bag. It started with the usual taunts and name-calling, but then it escalated. One day he and his friends cornered me in the locker room after gym class. They pushed me around, called me names, and when I tried to leave, Travis shoved me so hard that I fell and hit my head on the edge of a bench. I blacked out for a few seconds, and when I came to, they were all laughing. I had a gash on my forehead, and blood was running down my face. They left me there, lying on the cold tile floor while they walked away, still laughing. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. What was the point? No one would believe me, and even if they did, they wouldn't care. I just cleaned myself up as best as I could and went home. My parents didn't even notice the bandage on my forehead. Or maybe they did, and they just didn't care. When I finally graduated high school, I thought things would get better. I thought that maybe college would be different, that I could start fresh, leave all the pain and misery behind. But I was wrong. College was just a new version of the same old hell. I was accepted into a university far from home, which was the only blessing. I wanted to get as far away from my parents as possible, to put some distance between me and the life I was trying to escape. But the problem with running away is that you can't escape yourself. No matter where you go, your demons follow. University was supposed to be a place of learning, of growth, of new experiences. But for me, it was just another place where I didn't belong. I was surrounded by people who were smarter, more outgoing, more confident than I could ever hope to be. I was still that scared, lonely kid from high school. Only now I was in a new, unfamiliar environment. I tried to make friends, but I didn't know how. Socializing was like trying to speak a foreign language that I had never learned. I didn't understand the unspoken rules, the nuances of conversation. Whenever I tried to join in, I would say something awkward or off-putting, and the others would just give me that look half pity, half disgust, and then turn their attention back to each other, leaving me on the outside looking in. I spent most of my time in my dorm room, just like I had spent most of my time in my bedroom as a child. I would go to classes, do my assignments, and then retreat back to the safety of my small, cramped room. I didn't participate in any extracurricular activities, didn't go to any parties, didn't make any lasting connections. I was just existing, going through the motions of life without really living. The few interactions I did have with others were mostly negative. My roommates didn't like me, they thought I was weird, a loner. They would invite people over, and I would try to stay out of their way, but it didn't matter. They would mock me behind my back, laugh at me when they thought I wasn't listening. One time, they locked me out of the room as a joke, and I had to sleep in the common area. When I confronted them about it the next day, they just laughed and told me to lighten up. Then there were the professors. They didn't care about me any more than my teachers in high school had. I was just another face in a sea of students, another name on a roster. They would lecture at us, assign work, and then disappear. I was struggling to keep up with the workload, but I didn't dare ask for help. I didn't want to be seen as weak or stupid. So I suffered in silence, just like I always had. The loneliness was the worst part. It was a constant gnawing ache in my chest, a void that I couldn't fill no matter how hard I tried. I would see other students laughing together, talking about their weekends, making plans, and it was like a knife twisting in my gut. Why couldn't I be like them? What was wrong with me? I tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on my studies, but it was no use. The darkness was always there, lurking at the edges of my mind, waiting to consume me. There were nights when I would lie in bed, staring up at the ceiling, and the despair would become so overwhelming that I could barely breathe. I would curl up into a ball, tears streaming down my face, and wish for it all to end. But it never did. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and still, I was trapped in this cycle of misery. I thought about dropping out, but what would I do then? Go back to my parents' house? That was unthinkable. So I stayed, even though every day felt like a battle just to get out of bed. One day, something inside me snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't take the loneliness, the despair, the constant feeling of being unwanted and unloved. I packed a bag, took what little money I had saved up, and left. I didn't tell anyone where I was going because there was no one to tell. I just walked out of that dorm room, out of that university, and never looked back. I took a bus to a city I had never been to before, far away from everything and everyone I had ever known. I didn't have a plan, didn't know what I was going to do or where I was going to go. All I knew was that I needed to get away, to start over. The city was big, noisy, and indifferent. It was exactly what I needed. No one knew me here, no one cared who I was or what I had been through. I was just another face in the crowd, and for the first time in my life, that felt like a good thing. I found a cheap, rundown apartment in a bad part of town. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I got a job at a local diner, washing dishes and bussing tables. It was hard work, but I didn't mind. It kept my mind occupied, kept the darkness at bay. I didn't make friends, I didn't trust anyone enough to let them get close. But that was okay. I had learned a long time ago that people only hurt you if you let them in. So I kept to myself, kept my head down, and just focused on surviving. But no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to bury the past, it always found a way to catch up with me. The memories, the pain, the loneliness, they were all still there, just beneath the surface, waiting to drag me down. I didn't know how much longer I could keep running, how much longer I could keep pretending that everything was okay. But for now, it was enough just to be away from the people who had hurt me. It was enough to be in a place where no one knew my name, where no one expected anything from me. It was enough just to survive. And maybe one day it would be enough to start living again. Life in the city wasn't easy, but it was better than the life I had left behind. The job at the diner was grueling long hours, low pay, and the constant hum of customers and clattering dishes. But it was steady, and it kept me from thinking too much about the things I wanted to forget. The neighborhood wasn't great. Either the sounds of sirens and shouting were common, and the streets were filled with people who, like me, were just trying to get by. Despite it all, I found a strange sort of comfort in the anonymity of it all. Here, no one knew me, and no one cared. I was just another face in the crowd, and that was exactly what I wanted. The diner was owned by a woman named Mrs. Gallagher. She was in her late 50s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a demeanor that was as no-nonsense as it was fair. She had a reputation for being tough, but also for treating her employees like family, if they earned it. Most of the staff respected her, and those who didn't last long. I kept my head down, worked hard, and stayed out of trouble, which seemed to suit Mrs. Gallagher just fine. She didn't bother me, and I didn't give her a reason to. The first few months were uneventful. I worked double shifts whenever I could, saving every penny. I rented a small, dingy room in a rundown building where the rent was cheap and the neighbors minded their own business. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and for the first time in my life, I felt a sense of independence, however fragile it might be. One rainy evening, when the diner was quieter than usual, Mrs. Gallagher called me into her office. It was a small, cluttered space at the back of the building, filled with old receipts, stacks of paperwork, and a faint smell of stale coffee. She was sitting behind her desk, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose, studying a stack of invoices with a frown. "Sit down, kid," she said without looking up. I hesitated for a moment, then took a seat on the worn-out chair across from her. My heart was pounding in my chest. I hadn't done anything wrong, at least. Not that I knew of, but old habits die hard, and I couldn't shake the fear that I was about to be reprimanded. Mrs. Gallagher finally looked up, her sharp eyes studying me for a moment before she spoke. "You've been working here for a while now," she said. "You keep to yourself, do your job, don't cause any trouble. That's more than I can say for most of the people who come through here." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, my hands gripping the edges of the chair. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest. "But I've noticed something about you," she continued. "You're too smart for this job. I've seen the way you handle things, the way you think. You've got a good head on your shoulders. So tell me, why are you here? What's your story?" I was taken aback by the question. No one had ever asked me about my past before, not since I had left home anyway. I wasn't sure if I wanted to open up, but there was something about the way Mrs. Gallagher looked at me that made me feel like I could trust her. So I told her. I told her about my childhood, the abuse, the bullying, the loneliness. I told her about my time in college, how I had struggled to fit in, how I had finally run away and ended up here, in this city, with nothing but a bag of clothes and a desperate need to start over. Mrs. Gallagher listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When I finished, there was a long silence. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I had just shown her a part of myself that I had kept hidden for so long. I half expected her to tell me to get out, that she didn't want someone like me working in her diner. But instead, she nodded slowly, as if she understood. "You've been through a lot, kid," she said finally. "More than most people your age, but you're still standing. That counts for something." She paused, tapping her fingers on the desk thoughtfully. "You said you went to college. What did you study?" "Business administration," I replied, still unsure where this conversation was going. A small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. "Well, that's interesting. You see, I've been looking for someone to help me out with the books. This place isn't what it used to be. It's harder and harder to keep it running, and I'm not getting any younger. I could use someone with a head for numbers, someone who can keep things organized. You think you're up for that?" I was stunned. I had never expected anything like this. I had come to this city with no plan, no direction, just a desperate need to escape. And now, here was an opportunity, a real opportunity, to do something more, to use the skills I had learned in college, skills I had thought were useless. It was like a lifeline had been thrown to me when I least expected it. "I think I can do that," I stammered, still trying to wrap my head around what was happening. "Good," Mrs. Gallagher said, standing up and extending her hand. "Welcome to your new position, assistant manager. Don't let me down." I shook her hand, still in a daze. As I walked out of her office, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, excitement, fear. This was my chance to prove myself, to make something of my life. But it was also terrifying. I had never been in a position of responsibility before. What if I screwed up? What if I wasn't good enough? But I pushed those thoughts aside. I couldn't afford to doubt myself now. I had been given an opportunity, and I was going to make the most of it. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Mrs. Gallagher taught me the rope show to handle the finances, manage the inventory, schedule the staff. It was a steep learning curve, but I threw myself into it with everything I had. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of purpose, a sense of pride in what I was doing. I was no longer just surviving. I was building something, creating something. The staff was initially skeptical of my promotion. Most of them had been working at the diner for years, and they weren't too keen on the idea of taking orders from someone who had only been there a few months. But I was determined to earn their respect. I worked harder than ever, taking on extra shifts, helping out wherever I could. I made it clear that I wasn't just going to sit in the back office and push papers. I was going to be out on the floor, working alongside them, getting my hands dirty just like everyone else. Slowly but surely, things started to change. The staff began to see that I wasn't there to boss them around or make their lives harder. I was there to help, to make things run smoother, to make the diner a better place for everyone. And it wasn't long before they started coming to me with their problems, asking for advice, treating me like one of their own. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The diner had its fair share of problems that I quickly found myself having to deal with. There was the issue of the regulars who never paid their tabs on time, the suppliers who were always late with deliveries, the occasional troublemakers who would cause a scene and refuse to leave. Each day brought a new challenge, a new crisis to manage. One of the most shocking events happened on a busy Friday night. The diner was packed, and we were short-staffed. I was running around like a madman, trying to keep everything under control when suddenly, one of the regulars, a guy named Mike, who was known for being a bit of a drunk, started causing a scene. He was shouting at one of the waitresses, accusing her of shortchanging him on his bill. The waitress, a sweet girl named Jenny, who had been working there for years, was in tears. I rushed over to defuse the situation, trying to calm Mike down, but he was having none of it. He got up from his seat, his face red with anger, and started throwing punches. One of them caught me square in the jaw, and I went down hard. The whole diner fell silent as everyone turned to watch the commotion. For a moment, I just lay there, stunned, my head spinning. But then, something snapped inside me. I wasn't going to let this happen. Not here, not in the place that had become my sanctuary, my home. I got up, wiped the blood from my lip, and squared off with Mike. "You need to leave now," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. He laughed, a cruel, mocking sound, and took another swing at me. But this time, I was ready. I ducked, grabbed his arm, and twisted it behind his back. I said, "Leave," I repeated, my voice low and dangerous. He struggled for a moment, but then the fight seemed to drain out of him. He mumbled something under his breath and stumbled towards the door, leaving the diner in stunned silence. The aftermath was a blur. Jenny was still crying, and the other customers were whispering among themselves, unsure of what to do. I called the police, who arrived a few minutes later and took Mike into custody. Mrs. Gallagher was furious, not at me, but at the fact that one of her employees had been attacked in her own diner. She called a staff meeting the next day and made it clear that she wouldn't tolerate any more trouble from the regulars. "This is a place of business, not a bar brawl," she said, her voice cold as ice. The incident left me shaken, but also oddly empowered. I had stood up for myself, for the diner, for the people who worked there. And even though my jaw ached for days afterward, I felt a sense of pride that I hadn't felt in a long time. But the problems didn't stop there. The city, as it turned out, was a place where everyone had a past, and those pasts had a way of catching up with you when you least expected it. One night, after we had closed up for the evening, I was counting the day's earnings when the door to the diner burst open. A man I had never seen before stormed in, his eyes wild with anger. He was tall, muscular, and had the look of someone who had been through hell and back. He walked straight up to me, grabbed me by the collar, and slammed me against the wall. "You think you can just take what's mine?" he snarled, his breath hot on my face. I had no idea what he was talking about. "I don't know who you are or what you want," I managed to say, my heart pounding in my chest. "Don't play dumb with me," he growled, tightening his grip. "You've been messing with my business and now you're going to pay." It was then that I realized who he was. I had heard rumors about a local gang that operated in the area, running protection rackets and shaking down businesses for money. Mrs. Gallagher had refused to pay, and they hadn't bothered us until now. "I don't know anything about your business," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just work here." He sneered, a cold, vicious smile. "Well, now you're going to work for me. You're going to start handing over a cut of the diner's earnings, or it'll make sure you regret it." I felt a cold dread settle in the pit of my stomach. This was a situation I had no idea how to handle. I was just a guy trying to make a living, not someone who dealt with criminals. But I also knew that giving in to his demands would only lead to more trouble down the line. Before I could say anything, Mrs. Gallagher appeared behind him, holding a shotgun in her hands. "Get the hell out of my diner," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Or the next time you come in here, you won't be walking out." The man hesitated for a moment, then released me and stepped back, his eyes narrowing as he sized her up. "You're making a big mistake, old lady," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," she replied, not lowering the shotgun. "Now get out and don't come back." He glared at her for a long moment, then turned and left, slamming the door behind him. I slumped against the wall, my legs trembling with adrenaline. Mrs. Gallagher lowered the shotgun and gave me a hard look. "You did good, kid," she said. "But you need to be careful. This city isn't kind to people who get in the way." I nodded, still too shaken to speak. The reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. I had gotten myself involved in something way over my head, and now there was no turning back. The next few days were tense. We didn't know if the man would come back, if he would make good on his threats. But life at the diner continued as usual. The regulars came and went, the staff did their jobs, and Mrs. Gallagher and I kept a close eye on the door, waiting for the other shoe to drop. One evening, as I was closing up, a young woman walked into the diner. She was about my age, with dark hair and a haunted look in her eyes. She sat at the counter, ordered a cup of coffee, and stared into it as if it held all the answers to her problems. I couldn't help but notice how lost she seemed. There was something about her that reminded me of myself, of the person I had been before I came to this city. I walked over and asked if she was okay. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know where to go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have anywhere to go." There was something about the way she said it that broke my heart. I knew what it was like to feel lost, to feel like you had nowhere to turn. I offered her a warm meal and a place to sit for a while, and she accepted with a grateful smile. Over the next few weeks, she became a regular at the diner. Her name was Emily, and she had come to the city to escape a bad situation back home. She never went into detail, but it was clear that she had been through something traumatic. We struck up a tentative friendship, bonded by our shared experiences of running away and starting over. For the first time since I had left my old life behind, I felt a connection with someone. It wasn't romantic, neither of us was in a place for that. But it was something real, something that made the days a little easier to bear. But life in the city wasn't done throwing curveballs at me. One night, as I was walking home from the diner, I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was just someone else walking down the street. But then I realized that the footsteps were getting closer, faster. I turned around just in time to see a figure rush towards me, and before I could react, I was tackled to the ground. A fist connected with my face, and I saw stars. I tried to fight back, but the attacker was stronger, faster. He pinned me to the ground and punched me again and again, until I could taste blood in my mouth. "Stay away from Emily," he hissed in my ear, his voice filled with venom. "She's mine." Then, just as quickly as it had started, it was over. The attacker got up and disappeared into the night, leaving me lying on the cold pavement, gasping for breath. I managed to get to my feet and staggered back to my apartment, every step sending waves of pain through my battered body. I didn't know who the attacker was, or why he had come after me, but it was clear that Emily was in more trouble than I had realized. The next day, I confronted her at the diner, asking if she knew who might have done it. Her face went pale, and she looked away. "I told you I had a bad past," she said quietly. "There are people looking for me, people who don't want me to get away." I didn't press her for details. It was clear that she was terrified, and I didn't want to make things worse for her. But I also knew that this was something I couldn't ignore. If she was in danger, then so was I. Things came to a head a few nights later. I was closing up the diner when a group of men walked in. They were big, rough-looking guys, the kind you didn't want to mess with. They asked for Emily, but she wasn't there. They didn't seem to believe me, and one of them grabbed me by the collar, lifting me off the ground like I weighed nothing. "She's in trouble," he growled, "and if you're helping her, so are you." I was terrified, but I didn't let it show. I don't know where she is, I said, forcing myself to stay calm. But even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. The man tightened his grip, and for a moment, I thought he was going to break my neck. But then he let go, shoving me back against the counter. You better hope she stays gone, he said, his voice low and menacing. Because if we find out you're hiding her, we'll come back, and it won't be just a friendly visit. They left, and I sank to the floor, my heart pounding in my chest. This was getting out of control. I didn't know what Emily had done to get these guys after her, but it was clear that I was in way over my head. I didn't see Emily for the next few days, and I started to worry that something had happened to her. Then, one evening, she showed up at the diner, looking more haggard than ever. She asked if we could talk, and I led her into the back office, away from prying eyes. I need to leave, she said, her voice trembling. They're getting closer. I can't stay here anymore. I nodded, understanding that this was the only option. Where will you go? I don't know, she admitted, tears welling up in her eyes. But I have to keep moving. I can't let them find me. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to help her, but I didn't know how. I had no money to give her, no resources to offer. All I could do was wish her luck and hope that she would find a way to stay safe. Before she left, she handed me a small envelope. If anything happens to me, she said, give this to the police. It has everything they need to know. I took the envelope, feeling the weight of it in my hand. I will, I promised, even though I didn't want to think about what might happen to her. She left that night, and I never saw her again. For weeks, I kept an eye on the news, half expecting to hear about her body being found somewhere. But there was nothing. She had disappeared, just like she had come into my life, quietly, without a trace. Life at the diner returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after everything that had happened. The gang never came back, and Mrs. Gallagher seemed relieved that the whole mess had blown over. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the calm before the storm, that something else was coming. And I was right. One night, as I was locking up, I found a note slipped under the door. It was from Emily. She was alive, but she was still on the run. She thanked me for everything I had done and told me that she had found a place where she could start over, where no one would find her. She didn't say where it was, and I didn't ask. It was better that way. But the note also contained something else, something that sent chills down my spine. It was a warning, a plea for me to be careful, because the people who were after her weren't just after her anymore. They were after me too. I didn't know what to do. I had gotten myself involved in something dangerous, something that I didn't understand. And now I was a target. The next few weeks were a blur of paranoia and fear. Every time someone new walked into the diner, I tensed up, expecting trouble. I kept looking over my shoulder, waiting for the day when the men would come back, when they would make good on their threats. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, but I didn't know what else to do. Mrs. Gallagher noticed the change in me. She asked if I was okay, but I didn't tell her the whole truth. I didn't want to drag her into this mess, didn't want to put her in danger too. But I think she knew that something was wrong. She told me to take some time off, to get out of the city for a while, but I couldn't. I didn't have anywhere else to go. Then, one night, as I was walking home, I noticed a car following me. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, but then the car sped up and pulled up beside me. The window rolled down, and I saw the man who had attacked me before, the one who had told me to stay away from Emily. He didn't say anything. He just pointed a gun at me and fired. The pain was immediate, searing through my side like a hot knife. I collapsed on the sidewalk, my vision blurring as I tried to crawl away. The car sped off, leaving me bleeding out in the middle of the street. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, I was in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines, my body weak and battered. The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive, that the bullet had missed anything vital. But I didn't feel lucky. I felt scared, more scared than I had ever been in my life. The police came to take my statement, but I didn't have much to tell them. I didn't know who the man was, didn't know why he had shot me. All I knew was that I was in danger, and that I needed to get out of the city, fast. Mrs. Gallagher visited me in the hospital. She sat by my bed, holding my hand, and told me that I had a place at the diner for as long as I needed it. But I knew that I couldn't go back. I had brought too much trouble into her life, into the lives of the people who worked there. I couldn't stay and put them at risk. So, as soon as I was well enough to leave the hospital, I packed my bags and left the city. I didn't know where I was going, didn't have a plan. I just knew that I needed to disappear, to start over somewhere else, somewhere where the shadows of my past couldn't find me. And so I ran, just like I had run before, hoping that this time I could outrun the darkness that seemed to follow me wherever I went. But deep down, I knew that I could never really escape. The past has a way of catching up with you, no matter how fast or how far you run. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep running. I left the city behind me, the memories of my old life lingering like a dark cloud in my mind. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I had to keep moving. The pain in my side was a constant reminder of how close I had come to losing everything. I was determined not to let that happen again. I couldn't afford to. So I took the first bus out of town and headed to a new city, a place where I could start over again. The bus ride was long and uncomfortable. My side ached with every bump in the road, and the stale air inside the bus made it hard to breathe. I kept my head down, avoiding eye contact with the other passengers. I didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to explain why I was running away. Again. But I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever find a place where I could stop running. When the bus finally pulled into the station, I stepped off and found myself in a city that was both unfamiliar and strangely comforting. It was smaller than the last one, quieter, but it had a certain charm to it. The streets were lined with old brick buildings, and there was a sense of history in the air. It felt like a place where I could disappear, where no one would think to look for me. I found a cheap motel on the outskirts of town and checked in under a fake name. The room was small and dingy, but it was a place to sleep, and that was all I needed for now. I spent the next few days wandering the streets, looking for work, but I quickly realized that this town didn't have much to offer someone like me. Most of the jobs were already taken, and the ones that were available didn't pay enough to keep me afloat. I was starting to lose hope when I stumbled upon a small, run-down diner on the edge of town. The sign outside was faded, and the windows were covered in grime, but there was something about the place that drew me in. Maybe it was the smell of cooking food, or the fact that it reminded me of the diner where I had worked in the last city. Whatever it was, I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of customers sitting at the counter, nursing cups of coffee. The walls were covered in old photos and memorabilia, and the air was thick with the smell of grease and frying food. Behind the counter stood a man in his early 30s, his dark hair slicked back and his face lined with exhaustion. He looked up when I entered, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. "Help you with something?" he finally asked, his voice rough from years of cigarette smoke. "I'm looking for work," I said, trying to sound confident. "I've got experience in diners. I can cook, clean, whatever you need." The man eyed me for a moment, then nodded. "Name's Carlos," he said, extending a hand. "We could use some help around here. Place isn't what it used to be. You got a place to stay?" I shook his hand, grateful for the opportunity. "Yeah, I'm staying at a motel nearby." "Good," he said. "You start tomorrow. Pay's not great, but it's something. And if you're good, maybe we can work something out." I nodded, relieved to have found a job, no matter how small. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, I got to know Carlos and the other people who worked at the diner. There was Maria, the waitress who had been with Carlos since the beginning, and who could handle even the rowdiest customers with a smile. There was Joe, the cook, who had a temper as hot as the grill he worked on, but who knew how to make a mean burger. And there was Rosa, an older woman who handled the books and made sure everything ran smoothly. They were a tight-knit group, all of them struggling to keep the diner afloat. Business had been slow for years, and they were barely scraping by. But there was a sense of camaraderie among them, a bond forged by the shared hardships of running a failing business. They welcomed me into their little family, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. As the days went by, I started to take on more responsibilities at the diner. Carlos noticed that I had a knack for managing things, and he began to trust me with more of the day-to-day operations. I worked hard, pouring everything I had into the job. I wanted to prove to myself and to them that I was worth keeping around. One evening, after we had closed up for the night, Carlos and I sat at the counter, nursing cups of coffee. The diner was quiet, the only sound the hum of the old refrigerator in the back. Carlos lit a cigarette and took a long drag, then looked at me with those tired eyes. "You've been doing good work here," he said, blowing out a cloud of smoke. "Better than I expected." "Thanks," I replied, sipping my coffee. "It's been good to have something to focus on." He nodded, studying me for a moment. "You've got a past, don't you?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, but I'm trying to move on." "Aren't we all?" he said with a bitter smile. "This place, it's more than just a diner for us. It's a chance to start over, to build something out of nothing. We're all running from something, but here, we've found a way to keep going." I didn't say anything, but I understood exactly what he meant. The diner was a lifeline, a place where people like us could find a bit of stability in a world that had otherwise turned its back on us. As the months went by, I became more and more involved in the diner's operations. Carlos and I would brainstorm ways to bring in more customers, to make the place more profitable. We started offering daily specials, updated the menu, and even spruced up the interior a bit. Little by little, business began to pick up. But it wasn't just about making money. It was about creating a space where people could feel welcome, where they could forget their troubles for a little while. We started hosting community events, like bingo nights and trivia contests. The diner became a gathering place for the locals, a spot where everyone knew each other's names. One day, while going through some old paperwork, I found an old recipe book that had belonged to Carlos' grandmother. It was filled with traditional dishes, the kind of food that made you feel like you were at home. I suggested that we try adding some of these dishes to the menu, and Carlos agreed. The new dishes were a hit. Word began to spread, and soon people from all over town were coming to the diner to try the food. We were busier than ever, and for the first time, the diner was turning a profit. Carlos was thrilled, and I couldn't help but feel proud of what we had accomplished. As the diner's popularity grew, so did our ambitions. Carlos had always dreamed of opening more restaurants, of turning the diner into something bigger. And now, with business booming, that dream was starting to look like a real possibility. We began to talk seriously about expanding. Maria and Joe were on board, and Rosa, ever the pragmatist, started crunching the numbers to see if it was feasible. It was a risky move, but we were all in agreement if we were going to do this. We were going to do it right. The first step was finding a location for the new restaurant. We scouted out several places before finally settling on an old building in the heart of downtown. It was a fixer-upper, but it had potential. We pooled our resources, took out a loan, and set to work transforming the space into a restaurant. It was a lot of work, and there were times when it felt like we had bitten off more than we could chew. But we kept pushing forward, driven by the belief that we could make it work. And we did. The new restaurant was a success, even more so than the diner. People loved the food, loved the atmosphere. We had created something special, something that resonated with the community. With the success of the second restaurant, we started planning for a third, and then a fourth. Each new restaurant was a gamble, but each one paid off. Within a few years, we had built a small chain of successful eateries, each one carrying the same sense of community and warmth that had made the diner so special. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had found my purpose. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. I had a family, a community, and a business that I was proud of. Life was good, better than I had ever imagined it could be. But as with all things, the past has a way of catching up with you. One afternoon, as I was going over the books in my office, I received a call from the front desk. There were 2 people there to see me, the receptionist said. I asked who they were, but she didn't know. They hadn't given their names. Curious and a little uneasy, I went out to meet them. The moment I stepped into the lobby, I felt my heart drop into my stomach. Standing there, looking as out of place as they possibly could, were my parents. I hadn't seen them in years, not since I had left home. They looked older, more tired, but there was a coldness in their eyes that hadn't changed. "Son," my father said, his voice as hard and unyielding as I remembered it. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We heard about your success," my mother said, her voice clipped and formal. "We're here to talk business." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything they had put me through, after all the years of neglect and abuse, they had the nerve to come here and talk to me about business? "I don't think we have anything to talk about," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, I think we do," my father replied, a thin smile on his lips. "You see, your mother and I have been thinking. With all the success you've had, it's only right that we should have a stake in it. After all, we are your parents." I felt a wave of anger and disbelief wash over me. They had never cared about me, never supported me. And now they wanted to profit from my hard work? "No," I said, my voice firm. "You're not getting anything from me. You lost that right a long time ago." My father's eyes narrowed, and I could see the anger building in him. "You owe us," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "After everything we did for you, after all the sacrifices we made." "Sacrifices?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "You think what you did to me was a sacrifice? You think beating me, neglecting me, treating me like I was nothing was a sacrifice?" My mother stepped forward, her face pale and stern. "We did what we thought was best for you," she said. "We raised you, gave you everything you needed. And this is how you repay us?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were trying to twist everything, to make themselves out to be the victims. But I wasn't that scared, broken kid anymore. I wasn't going to let them manipulate me. "You didn't raise me," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You broke me. You made my life a living hell. And now you think you can just waltz in here and take what I've built? No. I'm done with you. Get out. My father's face turned red with anger, and for a moment I thought he might actually hit me. But then he took a deep breath and stepped back. This isn't over, he said, his voice cold and calculating. We'll see you in court. With that, they turned and left, leaving me standing there, trembling with rage and disbelief. True to their word, my parents filed a lawsuit against me, claiming that they were entitled to a share of the restaurants. They argued that they had provided for me during my childhood, that they had given me the foundation I needed to succeed, and that they deserved to be compensated for their sacrifices. I was shocked but not entirely surprised. This was who they were, cold, calculating and greedy. They didn't care about me, they just wanted what they thought was owed to them. I knew I couldn't fight this alone. I needed help, so I hired the best lawyer I could find, a woman named Claire Hamilton. She was sharp, tough, and had a reputation for winning even the most difficult cases. When I told her my story, she looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and determination. Well, win this, she said, her voice firm. They don't have a leg to stand on. The trial was grueling. My parents' lawyer painted them as the victims, as loving parents who had done everything they could to raise a successful son, only to be cruelly shut out of his life. They twisted the truth, distorted the facts, and tried to make me out to be an ungrateful, selfish child. But Claire was relentless. She cross-examined my parents, exposing their lies, their inconsistencies. She brought in witnesses who testified to the abuse I had suffered, to the neglect and the pain. She painted a picture of my childhood that was anything but happy, and by the end of the trial, it was clear that the jury was on our side. The verdict came back in my favor. My parents' claims were dismissed, and they were ordered to pay my legal fees. It was a victory, but it was bittersweet. I had won the case, but the experience had reopened old wounds, brought back memories I had tried so hard to forget. After the trial, I never heard from my parents again. They disappeared from my life as quickly as they had reappeared. I was free from them, free to live my life on my own terms. The restaurants continued to thrive, and I found solace in my work, in the community I had built. I had friends, colleagues, and a sense of purpose. But the scars from my past remained, a reminder of where I had come from, of the darkness I had escaped. In the end, I realized that I couldn't keep running from my past. It was a part of me, a part of who I was. But it didn't define me. I had built something good, something strong, and I wasn't going to let the shadows of my past take that away from me. And so I continued to move forward, one day at a time, finding peace in the life I had created, and knowing that no matter what, I had the strength to keep going.